If you're a regular viewer of my channel or the Behavior panel, you've heard me say things like this. That's a fascinating study about psychopathy. You should read it. I think you'd find that just wonderful. It's fascinating. It's really, when I saw me doing that, because I watched one of our episodes, our old episodes the other day, it irked me so bad I didn't know what to do. And because it sounds, I don't know what the sound of it is, but it's bad because it sounds like I know everything. Oh man, and I make fun of people who do that constantly. And I was one of them. So what I did was I went and looked up this thing called Notebook LM, and I've done it before, and I put these studies that I'm talking about in there. And what it does is this. It breaks it down and makes it really simple so anybody can understand it. It's an AI program. And then it makes this little presentation of it that has a person talking during that presentation explaining to you what all these things mean. But it's made in, they do it so it's really, really simple and it's simply understood. How's that sound? And so if you have some like me going, it's fascinating, the study on, I'm telling you, irked me to no end. So if you want to understand what those things are, then watch this video. I put 6 of those studies in here. They're not long. They're 3 minutes and 6 minutes. I think one is almost 7 minutes, but mostly they're really short, so it goes by quick. So if you want to learn about psychopathy, you want to learn some of these things, what I'm talking about in these studies, I'm looking all like I know everything, then watch this video. If you're not into that kind of thing, move on. Don't stay, because it's gonna bore you to death if you're not into that. But if you like these, watch it and hit the like button. That way I'll know if you want more of these, and I'll make more of these as if it gets a lot of views. If it doesn't, then I'll know it's as boring as I think it might be. So I won't make any more.
Today, we're going to dive deep into the science of the psychopathic brain. And let me tell you, it's not what you see in the movies. This isn't just about good versus evil. It's about a complex, dysfunctional network inside the human skull, and we're going to investigate what that actually means. So, why should we care about psychopathy? Well, let's start with the price tag. In the US alone, the financial damage caused by individuals with these traits is estimated to be a staggering $400 billion every single year. But the real cost, as you can imagine, isn't just about money. Get this, people with high psychopathic traits make up only about 2% of the population, yet they commit over a third of all violent crimes. Their impact on society is just massively out of proportion. And this is what we're calling the 2% problem. How can such a tiny group cause so much harm? Well, the first step to figuring that out is to really understand what psychopathy is in the first place. You see, in modern science, psychopathy isn't some simple yes or no diagnosis. It's not a switch that's either on or off. It's actually a collection of traits on a continuum. But at the high end of that spectrum, you find this core definition: a profound lack of empathy, absolutely no sense of guilt, and a scary combination of superficial charm and antisocial behavior. To make sense of all this, researchers usually group these traits into 4 key areas. You've got the interpersonal stuff, like being manipulative. Then there's the affective traits, which is all about that emotional coldness and lack of empathy. Next are the lifestyle traits, things like impulsivity and constant risk-taking. And finally, you have the antisocial factor, which covers everything from poor self-control to outright criminal acts. Okay, so we have a pretty clear definition. But that leads us to a really, really big problem. How do you reliably test for this? I mean, knowing the traits is one thing, but accurately identifying them in a person? That's a massive challenge. So this is the crucial question, right? How do we spot it? Because if we can't reliably diagnose this condition, we can't study it, we can't treat it, and we definitely can't manage the risks that come with it. For decades, the gold standard for diagnosis has been a psychometric test called the PCLR. Basically, it's a detailed checklist of traits and behaviors, and a professional uses it to score someone on the psychopathy spectrum. And here is where the whole thing just falls apart. To work, the test requires honest answers from the person being evaluated. But remember those traits we just talked about? Pathological lying is a big one. You see the paradox? It's a test that can be easily beaten by the very people it's trying to identify. It's a fundamental flaw.
Remember when we did the psychopath test on here? And people would say, well, all I have to do is lie about it. You'd never know I was a psychopath. That's true. That's what this professor is saying, or the person who did this study. That's what they're talking about. If you ask a psychopath or a suspected psychopath these questions like this, they're just going to lie about it, right? That's what they do. There's no way you could get a true action or reaction from them by asking them these questions. I believe that. So what you do is, over here, somebody in the field will say this. They'll ask these questions in a way that the suspected psychopath has no earthly idea they're being asked these questions. You set them up that way. You find out if they're glib. You find out if they're narcissistic. You find out all these things by asking questions. You use these questions from the psychopath test as the root. That's what you want to know. Are they this? But you ask them the question differently. So it doesn't work. The AI and the person doing the study is correct. If you were to ask them that way, the way that it's presented, wouldn't work. But when you do it in real life out in the field, you have to ask it in a different way. So the person doesn't know that you're asking those questions. That's the key. That's how it works. And people all the time, when we had that, we did it on here, the psychopath test, we took it, I did a whole video on it. And people would go through and say, look, man, all I gotta do is lie about this. And I was like, yeah, I know. But like I've said in the video beforehand, you ask the question differently. That's why it has to be given by a professional the right way. And the right way is not what this study is showing. They're there. They've got all the information. They're giving you all the information they've researched and know. That's good. But you have to take it into the real world and say, how can I use it there? If you're going to use it in the real world and actually try to find out if someone's a psychopath or not, you have to ask the questions in a different form. That's the key.
This means we need a totally different approach. We need a method that can't be faked, that can't be manipulated or lied to. We need an objective biological marker. And to find that, we have to go straight to the source, the brain itself. And that brings us right inside the brain. Our investigation is now shifting from psychology to neuroscience. We're no longer just asking questions, we're hunting for the physical signature of psychopathy. For years, the scientific community has had a prime suspect, a small, almond-shaped structure deep in the brain called the amygdala. You can think of it as the brain's main hub for emotion and fear processing. A dysfunctional amygdala lines up almost perfectly with so many psychopathic traits. I mean, think about it. If you can't process fear, you're not going to learn from punishment. If you can't recognize sadness in someone else's face, you're going to lack empathy. But what's really fascinating is that while it can be underreactive to fear, it can be hyperreactive to anger, which might explain those sudden, violent outbursts. So the case against the amygdala is strong. It explains the core emotional problems, that lack of empathy, and the issues with moral reasoning. But it doesn't explain the whole picture. It can't really account for the high rates of addiction or the impulsive, risk-taking lifestyle. The investigation can't end here. So what this tells us is that we're not looking for a single smoking gun here. It's way more like a complex puzzle with a lot of different pieces. So let's bring in the other suspects. Our next suspect is the orbitofrontal cortex, or the OFC, located right behind your eyes. This is a key area for decision-making and controlling impulsive behavior. In fact, when this area gets damaged, it can cause a condition that doctors call pseudo-psychopathy. OFC dysfunction, it explains some of the lifestyle and interpersonal factors, like being impulsive or having sudden bursts of aggression. But it fails to explain some of the most chilling aspects, like cold, calculated violence, or those deep-seated manipulative traits. It's another piece of the puzzle, for sure, but it's not the whole thing. All right, let's bring in our third and final suspect, the ventral striatum. Now, this is a critical part of the brain's reward system. It's what drives our motivation and manages how we expect to be rewarded for our actions. And this adds another really critical dimension. See, low activity here could explain that constant thrill-seeking and risk-taking. It's why we see such high rates of gambling and addiction in this population. But just like our other suspects, it doesn't explain that emotional void, the lack of empathy, or the pathological lying. So we have three key suspects: the amygdala, the OFC, and the ventral striatum. And not a single one of them on its own can explain psychopathy. This forces us into a completely new way of thinking about this, a total rewiring of the diagnosis itself. After decades of research, the main takeaway is this. Scientists were looking for the wrong thing all along. The hunt for a single broken part of the brain was a dead end. Psychopathy isn't caused by one faulty component. The new understanding is that psychopathy is a network problem. It comes from faulty connections between brain structures like the amygdala, the OFC, and the ventral striatum. Think of it like a city's traffic system. If the roads connecting different neighborhoods are all broken, the whole city malfunctions, even if the neighborhoods themselves are fine. It's the wiring, not any one part, that's the real issue. And this all leads us to a final and pretty profound question. If psychopathy is, at its very core, a disorder of the brain's physical structure and function, what does that mean for our concepts of personal responsibility, of guilt, and of justice? That's the challenge this science leaves for all of us to think about.
The mind of a psychopath. We're going to go on a full-on neurological investigation, peeling back the layers to see what's really going on inside their brain.
All right, let's just jump right into the central problem here, the thing that has stumped researchers for decades. I mean, think about it. If you're trying to diagnose someone whose defining feature is being a master of deception, how can you possibly trust a single word they say? It's a total catch-22.
So to even begin to crack this case, we have to build a clear profile of our subject. And that's harder than it sounds, because the very idea of what a psychopath is has been a moving target for more than 100 years.
You know, way back in the 19th century, the word psychopathy basically just meant sick mind. It was this huge, vague umbrella for pretty much any mental disorder. Then, by the middle of the 20th century, it got a lot more specific, describing someone who's immoral, violent, and just doesn't care about others. But today the picture is way more nuanced. And this is the key thing to understand. It's not some simple on or off switch. The modern view, called the four-factor model, sees it as a spectrum. You can think of it like a cocktail of traits that fall into four main categories. Interpersonal stuff, like being manipulative; affective, which is about the lack of empathy; lifestyle, so impulsivity; and of course, antisocial behaviors. So you might be asking, okay, but why put so much effort into this? Why does it matter? Well, let's take a look at the real-world stakes, because the impact this has on society is absolutely staggering.
Let's start with a number. $400 billion. That's the estimated financial damage every single year in the US alone from individuals with psychopathic traits. We're talking about everything from massive corporate fraud all the way down to the huge cost of the justice system.
And what about violent crime? Get this. While people with these traits make up only about 2% of the general population, they're responsible for over 1/3 of all violent crimes. That's an incredible statistic. And the personal cost is just devastating. They're 15 times more likely to struggle with substance abuse, which just multiplies the harm to themselves and everyone around them.
So with stakes this high, you'd think we'd have a foolproof way to identify this condition, right? Well, this is where things get really, really tricky. For a long time, the gold standard for diagnosis has been something called the Psychopathy Checklist Revised. You'll see it as the PCLR. It's a test that scores people on a bunch of different traits, and it's actually pretty good at predicting things like violent behavior and a lack of empathy.
But this slide right here shows you the giant paradox at the heart of the whole thing. On the one hand, the test is trying to measure things like empathy, remorse, guilt, and honesty. On the other hand, what are the core traits of psychopathy? A complete lack of empathy, remorse, and guilt, topped off with pathological lying. You're using a test that depends on honesty to diagnose professional liars.
Exactly. As the neurophilosopher Jesse Prinz put it, they are experts at putting on a mask of normality. They learn how to mimic being a normal person. This makes trying to diagnose them through conversation almost impossible, which is precisely why researchers turn to a tool that can't be tricked, a brain scanner.
So, if you can't trust what they say, what can you trust? Well, you can look inside their brain. And this is where it gets really fascinating. Researchers basically started treating this like a criminal investigation, creating a neurological lineup of suspects in the brain.
Okay, our first suspect in the lineup is a part of the brain right behind your eyes called the orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC. This area is a huge player in things like impulse control and making emotional decisions.
The OFC is kind of like the brain's brakes. It helps regulate sudden aggression and our sense of empathy. And we know that damage to this area can cause something called pseudo-psychopathy. But here's the catch. It doesn't explain the cold, calculating, planned violence that is such a core part of true psychopathy. So it's not the whole story. Next up in our lineup, the ventral striatum. The easiest way to think about this part of the brain is as the main reward and motivation center. It's the part that gets all fired up about a potential payoff. So this region is all about weighing risk versus reward. And in psychopaths, we see that it's often underactive, which is linked to all that impulsive, risky behavior, like gambling addiction. But again, by itself, it just doesn't explain the emotional coldness or the manipulation. It's another important piece, but it's not the whole puzzle. And that brings us to our final and primary suspect, the amygdala. It's this little almond-shaped structure, and it's basically the brain's emotional alarm system, especially when it comes to fear. For years, a dysfunctional amygdala was suspect number one. And it makes perfect sense, right? A problem here could easily explain that classic lack of fear and why they just don't seem to learn from punishment. But it turns out it's not the smoking gun either. It still doesn't explain all the antisocial behaviors or the addiction issues. So, if none of these individual brain regions is the single culprit, what's the verdict? We've brought in our three main suspects, but it seems like none of them could have pulled this off alone. Just look at this table. It lays it all out perfectly. The OFC is tied to impulsivity. The ventral striatum explains the risk-taking. The amygdala is linked to the lack of fear. But look at that last column. Each suspect leaves a huge part of the profile totally unexplained. It looks less like a single mastermind and more like a conspiracy. And that leads us to the final verdict from our investigation. The leading theory today is that psychopathy isn't caused by a single broken part. Instead, it seems to come from a complex network of dysfunctions, a permutation of problems across all of these different brain regions. The problem isn't one faulty component, it's the faulty wiring connecting them all. And so, that leaves us with this huge final question, one that's going to shape all the research going forward. If there isn't just one psychopathic brain, but maybe many different types, what does that mean for our justice system, for treatment, for our whole understanding of moral responsibility? It seems this investigation is far from over. What's really going on inside the mind of a psychopath? Let's take a look. Born evil or made? It's a question we've asked forever, and science is finally giving us clues. So what is psychopathy? Well, it's more than just bad behavior. It's a distinct personality disorder. People often mix it up with ASPD, or antisocial personality disorder, but they're not the same thing. See, the big difference is this. ASPD is about your actions. Psychopathy is about your personality. Now, aggression is a huge part of this. We gotta know there are two different kinds. You've got reactive aggression, that's hot-blooded. Then there's instrumental aggression, which is totally cold-blooded and planned. And here's the kicker. Psychopaths are at a higher risk for both types of aggression. That's key. So why is that? Our first clue is right here, inside the brain. Let's look closer. Okay, first up, the prefrontal cortex. This is basically the CEO of your brain, right? Well, studies show that in psychopaths, this CEO is often underactive. Sometimes it's even smaller. All right, next part of the brain, the amygdala. Think of it as your brain's alarm system. And for psychopaths, this alarm system is quiet. It doesn't react to fear or distress in others. So does this all start with the brain, or is it in their genes? That's our second clue. Get this, a massive review of studies found that antisocial behavior is about 50% inherited. Wow. And scientists are zooming in on certain genes. One is MAOA, sometimes called the warrior gene. This is huge. A study found it's not just the gene, but also what happened in childhood. So there's no single violence gene. Think of it more like a switch flipped by the environment. So what's the verdict? Yeah, it's complicated. There's no one single thing that causes psychopathy. It really is a perfect storm of genes, brain function, and of course, a person's life experiences. And we're just scratching the surface here. As you can see, the science is moving super fast. Which leaves us with a really deep question. If it's biological, what does that mean for free will?
You hear the word psychopath, and what pops into your head? I bet a very specific image comes to mind. But what if I told you that image is only half the story? What if there's another face, one that's hiding in plain sight? So let's peel back the mask and uncover the surprising reality of what it truly means to be a psychopath. So let's start right there. What exactly is a psychopath? Go ahead, picture one in your mind right now. What do you see? If you pictured, a ruthless CEO, a super cunning con artist, or maybe even a cold-blooded killer, well, you're not alone. That's the classic pop culture image we've all been fed. But what if that's not the full picture? That classic image isn't wrong, not exactly, but it only describes one type of psychopath. The truth is, there's a whole other side to this disorder, and it looks completely, and I mean completely, different. Okay, but before we can unmask that hidden face, we've got to clear something up. It's a really common point of confusion. People use the terms psychopath and narcissist like they're the same thing, but they are fundamentally different. Understanding this difference is absolutely key. So, here's the crucial difference. The narcissist is driven by this singular, all-consuming need for something called narcissistic supply. Think of it like fuel. They need a constant stream of attention, of admiration to prop up their fragile, false self. Without it, they basically crumble. And this slide really breaks it all down. For the psychopath, the goals are tangible, right? Power, money, sex. Their worldview is antisocial. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and they plan to be the top dog. The narcissists, though, they're kind of pro-social because they need people for their supply. Psychopaths will break the law without a second thought. Narcissists are a bit more subtle. They're more likely to subvert institutions from the inside. And here's the really chilling part. Psychopaths often get actual pleasure from hurting people, while for narcissists, the harm they cause is just collateral damage on the way to getting what they want. This leads us to a really powerful quote that just perfectly captures this. The author Sam Vaknin puts it this way: "Psychopaths do not fantasize, they act." See, while a narcissist is trapped in this fantasy world, always needing you to tell them how great they are, a psychopath is out in the real world, relentlessly, methodically executing a plan. And now we get to the main event, the big reveal of our explainer, the covert psychopath. This is not the successful, charming predator from the movies. No, this is the psychopath who failed. So internally, the covert psychopath is just a walking contradiction. On the one hand, they have this delusional sense of their own greatness, but it's built on a foundation of crippling anxiety and deep, deep insecurity. All of it is fueled by this vicious inner critic, and where does that come from? A life of humiliating failures. So how does all that inner chaos actually look on the outside? Well, it's not a charming mastermind. Instead, they often come across as socially awkward, maybe even the slacker with no real drive. They're sullen, passive-aggressive, but don't be fooled. Underneath all that is a cunning and incredibly vengeful mind. They might even hide behind a mask of morality or spirituality. It's a total performance to disguise who they really are. And there it is, the covert psychopath is the one who couldn't make it as a classic psychopath. Their inability to get the power or the status they feel they deserve creates this resentful, passive-aggressive, but no less dangerous version of the disorder. They really are the psychopaths in plain sight. Okay, so that's the theory. But how can we spot this stuff in the real world? Let's walk through 4 red flags that can help us identify these patterns. Now, look, this is not a diagnostic tool, obviously, but it is a fascinating look into how they operate. First up, watch out for someone who just seems too good to be true. They might hit you with this relentless charm offensive, constantly talking about how brilliant they are. Second, notice any information asymmetry. That's when they either tell you everything about themselves without asking a single question about you, or the opposite, they reveal nothing while mining you for your deepest secrets. Third is something called labored normalcy. This one is weird. Simple, everyday actions seem to require intense focus, but deviant behavior? That seems to come naturally. And finally, number 4, blaming others. It is never, ever their fault. This is a defense mechanism called an alloplastic defense, where they always blame the outside world for their failures. So this brings us to the final and maybe the most profound question of all. Where does this come from? You know, the whole nature versus nurture debate. Are people born this way, or are they made? Well, the clinical precursor, the childhood antecedent to adult psychopathy, is a condition called conduct disorder. And as you can see here, it's a pattern in kids and adolescents where they repeatedly and intentionally violate the rights of other people and break major social rules. This is where it starts. And to understand just how serious this is, just listen to this chilling quote from the source material. Some of these children gleefully hurt and torture people, or more frequently, animals. It shows this profound, disturbing lack of empathy right from a very, very early age. So this leaves us with a final, lingering question. With evidence pointing to everything from genetics to trauma to societal pressures, how should we even understand psychopathy? Is it a choice, a sickness, or is it a dark reflection of the world we live in? The answer, it seems, is as complex and two-faced as the psychopath itself. When you hear the word psychopath, what comes to mind? Probably a cold, calculating, fearless movie villain, right? But what if I told you the real story, the one that's actually happening inside the brain, is way more complicated and honestly a lot more interesting? All right, here's our game plan. First, we're going to tackle that big Hollywood myth of the psychopath. Then, we'll break down how scientists actually look at it in 4 distinct parts. After that, we'll get to peek inside the brain with this really cool experiment, uncover some genuinely surprising signals, and finally piece together a much clearer, more nuanced picture of what's going on. So, first things first. Let's start with that classic image, the one we all think we know. We've got to understand the myth before we can really appreciate the science that's starting to replace it. I mean, this is the textbook definition, isn't it? It paints this picture of someone who's almost like a different species, just totally lacking in basic human feeling. But as you're about to see, this simple idea is exactly what we need to challenge. See, scientists have a very different take. For them, psychopathy isn't some on or off switch. It's not like you either are one or you aren't. It's a spectrum, a collection of personality traits that exist on a continuum across the entire population. Yeah, that means in you and in me too. And, getting this right is absolutely critical. The estimated cost of psychopathy to society each year is just staggering. We're talking $400 billion. That's a huge reason why digging into the biological roots of these behaviors is so incredibly urgent. So to move past that simple, unhelpful label, researchers break the whole concept down. I want you to think of it like a sound mixing board in a recording studio. It's got 4 different channels, 4 different personality sliders that can each be turned up or down. And these are the 4 channels, or what scientists call facets: interpersonal, affective, lifestyle, and antisocial. Let's dive into what each of these sliders actually controls. First up, you've got the interpersonal facet. This is the manipulator. It's all about being deceitful, charming your way through life, having this really inflated sense of self. In the questionnaire used for this study, people were asked if they agreed with this statement: I would get a kick out of scamming someone. Next is the affective facet. Now, this is the one we usually think of, the cold-hearted part. It's about a serious lack of empathy, not feeling guilt. You can imagine the kind of question for this one. People sometimes say that I'm cold-hearted. The third slider is lifestyle. This is your classic thrill seeker, the impulsive risk taker. It's about needing constant stimulation, always pushing the boundaries. And the statement for this? You guessed it. I've often done something dangerous just for the thrill of it. And finally, we have the antisocial facet. This one is pretty much what it sounds like, the rule breaker. It's about having poor behavioral control and, a lot of the time, engaging in actual criminal activity. The question here gets right to the point. Have you broken into a building or vehicle in order to steal something? Okay, so we've got these 4 personality sliders, but how in the world do you connect them to the physical brain? Well, this is where the experiment comes in. Scientists used a brain scanner, an fMRI, to literally look inside people's heads while their brains were at work. And here is a super important detail. They didn't just go out and scan the brains of convicted felons. Nope, they brought in 200 young adults, college students from the general population. This is so key because it means whatever they found isn't just about the most extreme cases. It tells us something about how these traits and brain functions work across the entire spectrum, and all of us. So, how'd they do it? They watched 2 really fundamental parts of the brain in real time. To fire up the amygdala, which is basically the brain's threat detector, they had people look at emotional faces and react to angry and fearful expressions. Then, to get the ventral striatum, our brain's reward center, all lit up, they had them play a simple card guessing game where they could win some cash. Threat versus reward. You can't get much more basic than that. Okay, and now the big reveal. This is where it gets really, really interesting. Because when the researchers took the data from those 4 personality sliders and mapped it onto the brain activity they saw, they found something nobody expected. Not one simple pattern, but this complex, contradictory mix of opposite signals. So just look at this. This is the data that completely turns that old myth on its head. The interpersonal, or deceitful trait, That was linked to a lower amygdala response when looking at scared faces. Okay, that kind of fits the stereotype, right? They don't really process other people's fear. But, and this is the kicker, the lifestyle or impulsive trait was linked to a higher amygdala response to angry faces. That suggests they're actually more sensitive to being provoked. Two different traits, two opposite reactions in the exact same part of the brain. And on top of all that, that same impulsive trait was linked to a lower response in the brain's reward center. It just shows so clearly we're not looking at some uniformly fearless brain. We're looking at a brain with very specific and even clashing sensitivities. Exactly. Which brings us to the biggest takeaway here. The whole idea of a psychopath as just a fearless person, it's way too simple. It's wrong. Sure, some traits are linked to a turned-down threat response, but others are linked to a threat response that's turned way, way up. It all depends on the trait you're looking at and the specific trigger. So, what do we do with all this? Well, it means we have to move beyond the one-dimensional movie villain. It's time to embrace a much more complex and, frankly, more scientifically accurate picture of what's going on here. The bottom line is this. There is no single, one-size-fits-all brain signature for psychopathic traits. It's a dynamic relationship. The manipulative part of the personality might be tied to a brain that's deaf to fear, while the impulsive, thrill-seeking part is tied to a brain that's hyper-alert to anger. You might be wondering, well, how come we didn't see this before? It's because these four facets are all tangled up with each other. The researchers had to use this really clever statistical method to carefully pull them apart. It's like taking a blurry photograph and using a special filter to suddenly reveal these sharp, hidden details underneath. In this case, those details were opposing brain signals that were completely masked before. In the end, what this research really suggests is that what we call psychopathy isn't caused by one single flaw in the brain. It's much more likely to be a specific, maybe even unique, combination of these different neural vulnerabilities. Perhaps it's that perfect storm, a brain that doesn't register others' distress, gets easily provoked by threats, and has a dull reward system that creates the most destructive outcomes. And this leaves us with a pretty profound final thought. Remember, these patterns were found in ordinary young adults, not just inmates in a maximum security prison. So if these traits and their corresponding brain signals exist on a spectrum that runs through all of us, where exactly do we draw the line between a personality type and a disorder? What does it really mean to be normal? You know, in a courtroom or a clinic, a diagnosis of psychopathy can literally change a person's life. And for decades, it's a diagnosis that's been given way more often to men than to women. So today, we're diving into a really vital question. Is that a real-world fact, or is it actually a flaw in the science itself? So let's just get right to it. The big question at the heart of all this is pretty simple. Are men genuinely more psychopathic than women? Because for decades, all the data seem to point in one very clear direction. Okay, let's start with the numbers that built this whole assumption. If you look at offender populations, you'll see that up to 30% of men get diagnosed with psychopathy. For women, though, that number is quite a bit lower. It tops out at around 17%. So on the surface, the numbers look like they're telling a really clear story. But what if they're misleading us? First things first, you gotta understand just how deep this idea runs. This isn't some fluke or a finding from a single study. We're talking about a gender gap that has been a consistent finding in psychology for years and years. It really doesn't matter where researchers have looked, whether it's in prison populations or just the general community. Study after study has come back with the exact same results. On average, men score higher on psychopathy tests than women do. It's been a foundational assumption in this field for a very long time. But here's the twist. What if we've been looking at this all wrong? What if the problem isn't with the people being tested, but with the actual tests themselves? And this is really the core of the investigation. Is there a real, maybe biological, difference in psychopathy between the genders? Or are the very tools we use to measure it, tools that were often developed using mostly male subjects, are they fundamentally biased from the start? And getting this right is, well, as the paper puts it, critical. We absolutely have to be sure that our tests are capturing psychopathy in the same way for men and for women, because when they don't, the consequences can be life-altering. See, a psychopathy score isn't just some academic data point.
Hang on a minute. It's not psychopathy, it's psychopathy. AI really doesn't have the part worked out where it pronounces words correctly a lot of the time. So it's psychopathy, it's not psychopathy.
It's used out there in the real world to make incredibly high-stakes decisions, things like predicting violence, assessing the risk that someone will reoffend, and even figuring out treatment plans. If the test itself is biased, then every single one of those decisions is built on a flawed foundation. So, how in the world do scientists actually determine if a test is fair? Well, they use this really rigorous statistical method to check for something called measurement invariance. Think of this as the scientific gold standard for fairness in any kind of test. Measurement invariance basically confirms that a test is working the same way for everybody. It makes sure that a question about, say, impulsivity means the same thing and measures the same underlying trait for a man as it does for a woman. And to check for this, scientists use a 3-step process, and it gets stricter at each level. It's kind of like checking if a measuring tape is fair. First, are we all agreeing we're measuring length, not something else? Second, are the inches on that tape the same size for everyone? And third, does the tape actually start at 0 for everybody? The first, most basic check is for what's called configural invariance. This just asks if the test's overall structure even makes sense for both groups. For example, do all the questions that are supposed to measure cold-heartedness actually clump together logically for both men and women? If they don't, then we're not even measuring the same thing. Okay, so the second step, metric invariance, gets a little more specific. This is about making sure the inches on our psychological ruler are the same size for everyone. It asks if each individual question is an equally strong sign of psychopathy for both men and women. Because if a certain behavior is a huge red flag for men, but only a minor one for women, well, the ruler is broken. And finally, we get to the level that is so important for our question, scalar invariance. This checks if the test's baseline, its 0 point, is the same for both groups. If a test fails this check, any comparison of average scores is basically meaningless. Saying men score higher than women becomes scientifically invalid. It's like claiming someone is taller when their measuring tape started at the 10-inch mark. Okay, so now that we're armed with this understanding of what makes a test fair, what did the big systematic review of 28 different studies actually find? And this is where the evidence gets really messy. For the so-called gold standard checklist that clinicians use, the PCLR, the basic structure seems okay, but comparing scores is really questionable. A common self-report scale, the SRP, actually holds up pretty well, but another major inventory, the PPI, appears to be unfair at even the most basic level. There is just no clear consensus here. So what's the bottom line from all this research? Well, less than half of the major psychopathy tests even have a consistent structure for men and women. The evidence for fairly comparing scores is, and I'm quoting the paper here, highly inconclusive. The only test that consistently passed these fairness checks was a self-report scale. The supposed scientific consensus on this gender gap? It's built on some very, very shaky ground. So after digging through all of that, what's the verdict? Let's go all the way back to our original question. Are men really more psychopathic than women? After we've waded through all the scientific evidence, what's the verdict? Well, the answer is complicated. On the one hand, on the tests that do appear to be fair, men still tend to score higher on average. But, and this is a huge but, many of the most commonly used tests are simply not scientifically valid for making that comparison in the first place. The real takeaway is clear. We have to demand scientific rigor and be incredibly cautious about drawing simple conclusions, especially when people's actual lives are on the line. And this all leads to the paper's ultimate recommendation. It's a pretty powerful warning to all the professionals in the field. Be cautious. Be very, very cautious when you're interpreting these scores for women, because the standards and norms that we've established, which were often based on men, they might not apply at all. Which leaves us with one final, kind of provocative thought. Psychopathy is just one area. If our scientific tools for understanding the human mind are showing potential bias in this really high-stakes context, what other areas of psychology and medicine might need a closer, more critical look? It's a question that's definitely worth thinking about.